The courtroom in Redemption Falls, New Mexico Territory, smelled like sawdust, sweat, and desperation on the morning of October the 14th, 1883. Every seat was filled. Men in dusty boots and worn hats pressed shoulder to shoulder along the back wall. Women fanned themselves with folded letters and prayer cards. The judge had not yet called the room to order, but the verdict was already written in the eyes of every soul present, written there in pity, in dismissal, in the quiet certainty that Julia Hawkins was about to lose everything she had left in this world. Harlan Croft sat at the plaintiff's table in a fine black suit, his silver watch chain glinting under the single window's morning light. He was 50 years old, barrel-chested, and he owned 3 of the 4 largest ranches in the Cimarron Valley. The water rights to Broken Creek, the only reliable year-round source within 40 miles, were as good as his. His lawyer, a man named Aldous Peel who had been imported from Santa Fe specifically for this occasion, arranged papers with the theatrical calm of a man who had already won. And then there was Julia. She stood at the respondent's table alone. Not a single attorney sat beside her. She wore a dress of dark blue wool that was clean but not new, and her dark hair was pinned back under the direct, unadorned style of a woman who had no time for vanity and no patience for theater. She was 29 years old. She had been a widow for 14 months. Her husband, Thomas Hawkins, had died of a fever in the late summer of 1882, leaving her with a homestead of 240 acres, a herd of cattle that had since dwindled under pressure, a 12-year-old daughter named Rose, and a legal fight against a land empire that had destroyed 3 other families before hers. Everyone in Redemption Falls had counted her out. Everyone, that is, except for one man who stood at the very back of the room with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, watching Julia Hawkins with an expression that no one in that room could have properly named. Cornelius Barker was not a man who impressed easily. He had spent 15 years riding as a range detective and land surveyor across Texas, Oklahoma Territory, and New Mexico. He had faced down cattle thieves and corrupt sheriffs and land barons with private armies. He was 35 years old, 6 feet and 2 inches of lean, weather-hardened muscle, with dark eyes that missed nothing and a silence about him that most men found more unsettling than a raised gun. He had come to Redemption Falls 3 weeks ago on a surveying contract for the territorial government, a contract that, he had since discovered, had dark and complicated connections to Harlan Croft's water rights ambitions. He watched Julia Hawkins open a leather document satchel and begin laying papers across the table with quiet, methodical precision, and something moved in his chest that he had not felt in a long time. He told himself it was professional admiration. He was wrong. The trouble had started, as most trouble did in the Cimarron Valley, with a lie told in ink. 14 months earlier, when Thomas Hawkins had still been alive, he had filed a water rights claim with the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe under the prior appropriation doctrine, first in time, first in right, documenting that the Hawkins homestead had been drawing water from Broken Creek continuously since 1878. It was a solid, legitimate, well-documented claim. Thomas had been a careful man who believed in paper trails, and he had kept meticulous records, dates of irrigation, cattle head counts at the creek, seasonal water measurement logs that he marked in a brown leather notebook with the same disciplined handwriting he had used for everything in his short life. When Thomas died, those records passed to Julia. And when Harlan Croft filed his competing claim in the spring of 1883, disputing the Hawkins priority date and asserting that his own eastern access point on Broken Creek predated the Hawkins claim by 2 years, Julia had understood immediately what was happening. This was not a legal dispute. This was an erasure. Croft wanted the Hawkins land dead and dry so that his cattle empire could extend uninterrupted from the northern ridge to the southern valley floor, and cutting off their water was the cleanest way to accomplish it without gunfire. She had gone to 2 attorneys in Redemption Falls. The first told her the case was too complex and the opposition too powerful and declined. The second took a retainer of $60, nearly all the cash money she had reviewed the documents for 2 weeks, and then returned them to her with a letter of withdrawal that gave no explanation. She found out later that Aldous Peel had visited that attorney's office the very afternoon before he sent the withdrawal letter. Betrayal had followed betrayal. The county recorder's office produced a copy of the Croft claim that appeared to predate the Hawkins filing by several weeks, a discrepancy that Julia knew with absolute certainty was manufactured, because she had been present when Thomas filed the original claim, and she had the receipt in her hand. But the county recorder, a weasel of a man named Dix Halbert, swore under oath in the preliminary hearing that the Croft documents had been in his files since 1876. Julia had looked at those fraudulent documents in that preliminary hearing and felt something cold and clear settle into her spine. Not fear, something harder than fear, something that felt very much like the beginning of a plan. She had gone home that night, put Rose to bed, sat down at the kitchen table with her husband's surveying instruments. Thomas had been a trained land surveyor before he became a rancher, and she had begun to work. Thomas Hawkins had taught Julia everything he knew about land surveying. She had been, in his own words, a faster learner than any man he had ever trained, with a natural aptitude for mathematics and spatial reasoning that had left him half astonished and entirely proud. She understood chain measurements and theodolite readings, metes and bounds descriptions, and the legal language of the prior appropriation doctrine as written in the territorial statutes. She had helped Thomas prepare every one of his original water rights filings. She knew those documents with the intimacy of someone who had spent long winter evenings, bent over them by lamplight with her husband's hand warm over hers, both of them building something they believed would last. Now she was going to use that knowledge to dismantle a lie in open court, without a lawyer, in front of everyone who had already written her eulogy. The story of how Cornelius Barker came into her orbit began 3 weeks before the trial, on a Tuesday morning when Julia drove her wagon into Redemption Falls to file a motion with the court clerk. She was coming down the main street when she heard raised voices from outside the land office, and she slowed the wagon instinctively, because raised voices near a land office in 1883 New Mexico were never a casual thing. A man was being told to leave. He was tall, dark-haired, and he held a rolled survey map in one hand with the very particular posture of someone who was not accustomed to being dismissed and was not going to accept it quietly. He was speaking to the deputy land commissioner, a soft-faced functionary named Briggs, and what he was saying made Julia pull the wagon to a complete stop and sit very still. "I am telling you," Cornelius Barker said, his voice carrying the low, careful patience of a man controlling his temper with great deliberate effort, "that this survey map shows a discrepancy of over 300 yards in the recorded boundary of the Croft Eastern Access Easement. That discrepancy is not a surveying error. Survey errors do not happen consistently in one direction. This was adjusted, deliberately." Briggs made a dismissive gesture with his soft hands. "Mr. Barker, the territorial government contracted you to survey the northern range, not to audit existing land records. The territorial government contracted me to provide accurate survey data for the entire Cimarron Basin," Cornelius said. "That is what I am doing. Your findings will be submitted in the standard report format and reviewed through the appropriate. The trial is in 3 weeks, Briggs. That is not your concern." There was a silence that was not peaceful. Then Cornelius Barker looked up from the deputy land commissioner's soft, evasive face, and his dark eyes landed on Julia Hawkins sitting in her wagon across the street. She did not look away. She met his gaze with a directness that startled him, and in her expression he read something he had not expected, not desperation, not the dull hopelessness of someone who had already surrendered, but a sharp, measuring intelligence that was assessing him the same way he suspected he was assessing her. He stepped off the land office porch and crossed the street. "Mrs. Hawkins," he said, because her name was on every set of lips in town. "Mr. Barker," she replied, because she had already made it her business to know who the territorial surveyor was and what he was doing in Redemption Falls. He looked at her for a moment with those dark, serious eyes. "You heard that?" "I did. You're representing yourself in this trial." "I am." He was quiet for another moment, studying her in the way that people rarely had the patience or the respect to study another person. Not assessing her as a woman, not measuring her smallness against the size of the problem, but looking at her the way he would look at a map, searching for the real lines beneath the decorative ones. "I have survey data that directly contradicts the boundary descriptions in the Croft easement filing," he said, "and I believe those boundary descriptions were deliberately falsified to manufacture a prior claim date." Julia Hawkins reached into the document satchel at her feet and withdrew a sheaf of papers. She turned to a specific page with the unhurried precision of someone who knew exactly where everything was, and she held it out to him. "I know," she said. "I calculated the same discrepancy 11 days ago using my husband's original survey instruments and his field notes from 1878. The eastern access point marked in Croft's filing sits on land that was not part of the Croft eastern boundary in 1876, as demonstrated by these chain-end compass measurements cross-referenced against the original territorial patent map." Cornelius Barker took the papers. He read them. He read them again. His expression underwent a slow, private transformation, the kind that happens in a man who considers himself thorough and competent and has just encountered someone more thorough and more competent than he expected. He looked up at her. "You did these calculations yourself," he said. It was not quite a question. "My husband taught me surveying," Julia said, taking the papers back with a calm that cost her nothing. "He was good at it, I was better." Something in Cornelius Barker's chest shifted like tectonic plates. He was not accustomed to being shaken by a statement of plain fact. He was not prepared for the way it reached into him and rearranged something fundamental. "Mrs. Hawkins," he said carefully, "I think we should talk." They talked for 4 hours that first day, sitting at the long table in the back room of Millie Pierce's boarding house, which Millie kept available for town meetings, and which she unlocked for Julia with a pointed look at Cornelius that communicated very precisely the terms under which she was doing so. They spread papers across the table and spoke the language of survey chains and water flow measurements and territorial statute citations, and within the first hour, Cornelius Barker realized that Julia Hawkins was not simply competent. She was extraordinary. She had constructed an entire legal and surveying case from scratch, without counsel, using primary source documents, her own field measurements, and a working knowledge of territorial water law that was more sophisticated than that of most practicing attorneys he had encountered. She had identified not one but 3 specific inconsistencies in the Croft filing. She had documented the suspicious timing of the county recorder's revised filing date, with a paper trail that implicated Dix Halbert in document manipulation. She had cross-referenced the original territorial patent records, which she had traveled to Santa Fe to personally obtain, a 3-day journey, against the chain measurements that Croft's surveyor had filed, and she had demonstrated with mathematical precision that the claimed prior use date of 1876 was physically impossible given the recorded location of Croft's earliest infrastructure. Cornelius sat back in his chair and looked at her across the table. He had been in this territory for 15 years. He had met cattlemen and homesteaders, lawyers and judges, outlaws and land commissioners. He had met precisely nobody like Julia Hawkins. "You need a witness," he said. "Someone who can speak to the survey discrepancies in court. Someone whose professional credentials the judge can't dismiss." Julia nodded slowly. She had been waiting for this part of the conversation. She had known it was coming the moment she heard him arguing with Briggs outside the land office. And you need someone who can place those survey discrepancies within the specific legal framework of the prior appropriation doctrine as it applies to this claim, she said. Yes, he said. So we each have what the other needs, she said. There was a pause that was not empty. It was full of something new and uncertain and cautious, the particular silence of two people who are each accustomed to working alone and are each, in this moment, finding that possibility more complicated than usual. Yes, Cornelius said again, and his voice was different this time. Quieter. He rode out to the Hawkins homestead 2 days later, ostensibly to take new field measurements along Broken Creek. He brought his theodolite and his chain measure and his field notebook, and he walked the creek with Julia for 6 hours in the pale autumn sunshine, recording measurements that corroborated and extended the calculations she had already made. Julia walked the land the way she owned it, which she did, with the long-striding, unhurried confidence of someone who knew every rock and bend and seasonal marking of the water. She pointed out the original survey markers Thomas had placed in 1878, which were still present in the ground, and she showed Cornelius the places where the annual flood line of Broken Creek demonstrated continuous, heavy use that could only be consistent with large-scale cattle watering operations dating back to the earliest period of occupation. She also showed him the 2 places where someone, she did not say craftsmen directly, but her meaning was entirely clear, had attempted to obscure those original markers. One had been dug up and moved approximately 12 feet toward the southern bank. The other had been driven deeper into the ground with a rock, presumably in the hope that it would no longer be visible. Cornelius crouched beside the second marker, looked at the disturbed earth around it, and felt a cold, hard anger move through him. This was not a legal dispute. This was a campaign of erasure, patient and systematic and entirely contemptible. He looked up at Julia, who was standing above him with the afternoon light catching the dark wing of her hair and her expression composed and watchful and entirely, perfectly steady. "I'm going to testify on your behalf," he said, "whatever it costs." She looked at him for a moment with those clear, measuring eyes. "It may cost you the government contract," she said. "Briggs answers to people who answer to Croft's money. I know. You would lose work you came here to do." "The work I came here to do," he said carefully, "appears to have been arranged in part to benefit Harlan Croft's land ambitions. I have a problem with that." She nodded once, a small economical motion that conveyed more than a longer response would have. She reached out and laid her hand briefly on his shoulder as she stepped past him to note something in her own field book, and the touch was brisk and entirely practical, but it moved through him like creek water in spring, cold and clear and startlingly alive. He spent the following evenings at the Pierce boarding house, and Julia drove in from the homestead each morning. Rose came with her sometimes, a serious, dark-haired child with her mother's eyes and her father's quiet watchfulness, and she would sit in the corner of the back room with a schoolbook while the adults worked, occasionally looking up at Cornelius with an expression that was evaluating and not entirely approving, which he found both understandable and faintly daunting. The hidden motive behind the Croft water claim became clearer to them over those 3 weeks, and it was darker than a simple land grab. Cornelius, using his surveying access and some careful questioning of men in the local saloon who talked more freely after 2 whiskeys than before, pieced together a picture that he brought to Julia on a Tuesday evening when the sky outside was turning the deep, cold purple of a New Mexico autumn dusk. Croft was not only trying to expand his water access, he was preparing to sell. A railroad spur was being surveyed for the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe line, and the route under consideration ran directly through the Cimarron Valley. The party who controlled the water rights to Broken Creek would control the most viable resupply point for the entire eastern stretch of that route. The water rights, if consolidated under Croft's name before the railroad deal was finalized, were worth roughly $30,000, a staggering sum in any era, and a fortune in a New Mexico valley in 1883. Julia listened to this without speaking, sitting very still with her hands flat on the table. When Cornelius finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Then it was never about the cattle," she said. "No," he said. "The cattle were the cover. This was always about the railroad." She looked at him across the table, and something complicated moved through her expression: grief and anger, and the cold satisfaction of confirmation. She had known it was betrayal. She had not known the precise shape of it until now. "Thomas would have known," she said quietly. "He followed the railroad surveys. He always said whoever controlled the water in this valley had something worth protecting." She said it without sentimentality, or rather, with sentimentality so compressed and disciplined that it came out sounding like fact, which was somehow more devastating than open grief. Cornelius sat with it in silence, which was the right thing to do, and which he knew was the right thing to do because he had some experience with the kind of grief that does not want to be soothed, only witnessed. After a moment, Julia raised her chin and looked at him with that particular expression that he had come to recognize, the expression that meant she was moving from feeling into action, which happened so swiftly and cleanly in her that it was like watching a door close. "Then we need to make sure the court record documents the railroad connection," she said, "so that even if Croft's men attempt to obscure or suppress the outcome, there is a public record that names the real stakes of this claim." "Agreed," Cornelius said. He paused. "You've been planning to bring this into open court all along." She met his eyes. "I've been planning to survive," she said. "In this territory, in this time, with this claim, surviving means being seen. It means making it impossible to quietly erase. It means doing this in public in front of everyone so that the record exists." He looked at her for a long moment, and something in the region of his chest that he had kept very carefully closed for a long time felt something he could only describe to himself, in the privacy of his own mind, as dangerous. He had been in love once before, briefly and badly, with a woman in Austin who had wanted him to stop writing survey contracts and take a desk position, which he had been unable to do, and which had ended things between them in a way that left him with a residual wariness about the entire enterprise of caring for someone. He was not a man who did things halfway. He was not a man who could love at a safe distance. He had understood, after Austin, that it was simpler and safer to be alone, and he had organized his life accordingly. But Julia Hawkins was sitting across a table from him with survey maps spread between them and her dead husband's mathematics in her hands, and a plan so carefully constructed and so fearlessly executed that it made his throat tight. And he was not, he was discovering, as well armored as he had believed himself to be. He said none of this. He folded his field notes and reached for his hat, and told her he would have his formal survey report prepared by Friday, which she could enter into evidence. She thanked him with her customary brisk precision and walked him to the door, and when he stepped out into the cold night air, she stood in the doorway for a moment with lamplight behind her and said, "Cornelius." He turned. "What you're doing," she said, "matters to me. I want you to know that." She said it the way she said everything, directly and without ornamentation, and then she went back inside and closed the door, and he stood in the street for a moment longer than he needed to. The night before the trial, Julia sat alone at the kitchen table of her homestead long after Rose had gone to bed. She had everything prepared. The documents were organized in the leather satchel in the order she would need them. She had written out her arguments on paper and rehearsed them until the words came without thinking, until the structure of her case was as natural to her as breathing. She had done everything a person could do. She allowed herself, in the privacy of that dark kitchen with the fire burning low, one moment of pure, exhausted fear. Not of losing, though losing was real and terrible, and would mean the end of everything Thomas had built, everything she had fought to keep, the only home Rose had ever known. Not even of that. What she was afraid of in the deepest, most honest part of herself was the loneliness of it. The radical, exposed aloneness of standing in that courtroom without a lawyer, without a husband, without anyone between her and Harlan Croft's money and power, except her own mind and her own records and one territorial surveyor who had, against all sensible self-interest, decided to stand beside her. She missed Thomas with a sudden, physical sharpness that surprised her. Not often anymore. Grief had settled into her bones as something quiet and chronic rather than acute. But tonight it was acute. She missed the weight of his hand on her shoulder and the sound of his voice working through a problem in the dark. She missed having someone who knew what she was. And then she thought about Cornelius Barker, who had sat across from her every day for 3 weeks and who looked at her with those dark, serious eyes as though she were, what? Not simply useful, not simply capable, something more than that, something she was not quite ready to name. She closed her eyes and sat with all of it, and then she opened her eyes and picked up her pen and wrote 3 more pages of case notes, because fear was not an argument and grief was not a legal strategy. And in 14 hours, she was going to walk into a courtroom and do something that everyone in Redemption Falls believed was impossible. She was going to win. The morning of the trial, Cornelius was waiting outside the courthouse when Julia arrived with Rose. He was standing on the steps in a clean shirt and his best jacket, his dark hair neat, his expression the same careful stillness it always carried. But when he saw her coming down the street with her satchel and her straight back and her chin up, something happened in his face, a brief, unguarded thing that came and went before anyone watching could have named it properly, but which Julia, who was watching carefully, saw. He walked down the steps to meet her. "Ready?" he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for one more moment, and then he said, in a voice low enough that only she could hear it, "For what it's worth, Mrs. Hawkins, I've spent 15 years watching people fight for land claims in this territory. I have never in my life seen anyone prepare a case the way you've prepared this one." Julia Hawkins looked at Cornelius Barker standing in the morning light with complete honesty and said, "Then let's go make sure it counts." He held the courthouse door open for her, and she walked in, and the room was already full. Judge Ellis Crandall was a circuit judge out of Santa Fe, 60 years old, with a reputation for fairness and a permanent expression of impatient skepticism that was distributed equally to all parties before him. He had seen every kind of land fraud and water rights manipulation that the New Mexico Territory had to offer, and his eyebrows had long since settled into a permanent position of moderate elevation that signaled nothing about his conclusions. He called the court to order, and the room went still with the particular electric quality of a crowd that has decided it is watching a spectacle, but is faintly ashamed to be enjoying the anticipation of it. Aldous Peele opened for Harlan Croft with polished, practiced confidence. He presented the Croft filing documentation, the county recorder's testimony regarding the filing dates, and a survey report prepared by Croft's own hired surveyor, a man named Selden who had come down from Colorado, that confirmed the prior use date of 1876. He spoke for 30 minutes in the fluid, authoritative cadence of a man who had never seriously considered the possibility of losing. When Judge Crandall turned to Julia Hawkins, the room did not quite hold its breath, but it came close. Julia rose. She opened her satchel and placed her first document before the court, Thomas Hawkins's original land office receipt, dated March the 18th, 1878, confirming the filing of a water rights claim for Broken Creek under the prior appropriation doctrine. She placed the territorial land office's own stamped and dated copy alongside it. She said, in a clear and unhurried voice, "Your Honor, the respondent's claim to water rights on Broken Creek is documented, continuous, and predates the revised filing date that the plaintiff's counsel has presented by evidence of document alteration. I intend to demonstrate 3 things. First, that the original Croft easement filing does not and cannot predate the Hawkins claim, because the physical boundary it describes did not exist in its current form in 1876. Second, that the county recorder's revised filing record, contains discrepancies that indicate unauthorized post facto alteration. Third, that the plaintiff's motive for this proceeding involves undisclosed commercial interests that have a direct bearing on the court's assessment of the competing claims. The room shifted. Even Aldous Peel briefly ceased to look quite so comfortable. Judge Crandall's permanent eyebrows moved approximately 3 millimeters upward. He said, "Proceed." Julia proceeded. She was methodical. She was precise. She was, beneath her precision, utterly relentless. She placed each document before the court with a running commentary that translated the technical surveying language into terms accessible to the judge and the room. And she never condescended and never simplified to the point of distortion. She introduced Thomas Hawkins's field notebooks, 5 years of meticulous seasonal water records, and she guided the court through them entry by entry, building a picture of continuous, documented use that was so dense with specific detail that no invented counter-narrative could match it for texture and credibility. When she came to the boundary discrepancy in the Croft easement, she unrolled a large map onto the table before the judge, a map she had drafted herself, to scale, using the chain and compass field measurements she and Cornelius had taken 3 weeks ago along Broken Creek. She placed the original territorial patent map beside it. She placed Croft's filed survey report beside that. And she walked the court, step by step, through the 312-yard discrepancy between where Croft's filing claimed his eastern access point to have been in 1876 and where the physical evidence of the creek itself, the original survey markers, and the territorial patent map placed it. "This discrepancy," she said, placing her finger on the map at the specific point of variance, "is not a surveying error. Surveying errors are random in their distribution. They do not, as any trained surveyor will tell the court, consistently favor one party's legal position across multiple measurement points in a single filing. What the court is looking at is a series of adjusted boundary descriptions that each move, without exception, in the direction that benefits the plaintiff's claim to prior use." She turned to Cornelius. Cornelius Barker testified for 40 minutes. He had a professional surveyor's credentials that Peel's cross-examination could not shake, and did not seriously attempt to shake, because Peel was good enough to know that attacking a government-contracted surveyor's technical competence was not a winning strategy with a Santa Fe judge who had seen every trick. Cornelius walked the court through his own independent measurements, which confirmed and extended Julia's calculations. He identified, by GPS coordinates in the contemporary sense, the precise locations of the original survey markers, including the one that had been driven deeper and the one that had been moved. He introduced his formal survey report, stamped by the Territorial Land Office, as court evidence. And then Julia asked him the question she had saved for last. "Mr. Barker," she said, "in your professional opinion, is the discrepancy between the Croft easement filing and the physical evidence consistent with accidental error, or with deliberate manipulation of recorded boundaries?" Peel was on his feet. "Objection. Your Honor calls for speculation." "It calls for professional expert opinion," Julia said smoothly, without raising her voice, "which is precisely the purpose for which Mr. Barker has been called. The court has established his expertise." Judge Crandall looked at her for a moment with his elevated eyebrows, and then he looked at Peel, and then he said, "Overruled. Mr. Barker, you may answer." Cornelius looked directly at the judge. "In my professional opinion," he said, "the pattern of discrepancies in the Croft easement filing is consistent with deliberate post hoc adjustment of recorded boundaries to manufacture a false prior use date. It is not consistent with surveying error." The room exhaled. Harlan Croft, sitting at the plaintiff's table in his fine black suit, said nothing, but his jaw tightened to a degree that was visible from across the room. Julia was not finished. She called the county recorder, Dix Halbert, as her next witness, and what she did to Dix Halbert in the subsequent 20 minutes was, by the assessment of every person present, one of the most precise and merciless pieces of cross-examination that the Redemption Falls courthouse had ever witnessed. She had Halbert acknowledge, under oath, that the standard procedure for land filing documents in the Territorial Land Office was that received filings were date-stamped on the day of receipt, recorded in the intake ledger in chronological order, and assigned a sequential filing number. This Halbert confirmed, because he could not deny it without perjuring himself in a manner too obvious to survive. Julia then produced a certified copy of the intake ledger from the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe, not the county office, which was under Halbert's direct control, but the Territorial Office, whose copies she had obtained during her trip there, and she asked Halbert to explain why the filing number assigned to the Croft easement in the county records did not appear in the corresponding sequential position in the Territorial Ledger, but rather appeared 6 filing numbers later, which would place it after, not before, the Hawkins water rights claim. The silence that followed was extraordinary. Halbert opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at Peel, who could not help him. He looked at Harlan Croft, who was now studying the surface of the table as though it contained information of compelling importance. "Mr. Halbert," Judge Crandall said, in a voice that had lost all trace of impatient skepticism and replaced it with something considerably colder, "the court is waiting." Halbert said, in a voice reduced to a damaged whisper, that there might have been a clerical discrepancy. "A clerical discrepancy," Julia said, and she let the words sit in the room for a moment with all their weight. "Your Honor, the respondent's position is that this is not a clerical discrepancy, but evidence of fraudulent alteration of official territorial records, and that this alteration was performed in conjunction with the adjusted boundary descriptions in the Croft survey filing for the purpose of manufacturing a false claim to water rights that do not, legally or factually, belong to the plaintiff." She paused, and then she delivered the final piece. "Your Honor, I would further bring to the court's attention," and here she produced the last document in her satchel, a letter obtained through Cornelius's contacts in the Santa Fe territorial offices, documenting preliminary negotiations between the Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe Railroad and Harlan Croft regarding a water supply easement contingent upon the finalization of the water rights claim currently before this court. That the true commercial motive for this proceeding involves undisclosed railroad interests valued at not less than $30,000. The plaintiff has represented this action to this court as a dispute over cattle water access. The court deserves to know that it is, in fact, a dispute over a commercial transaction of this magnitude, and that the fraudulent document manipulation that has supported this claim was not undertaken to protect a ranch's water supply, but to secure a financial windfall at the direct expense of a widow and her child. The room did not exhale this time. The room held everything it had and went completely silent. Harlan Croft's chair scraped back from the table. Judge Crandall raised one hand without looking up from the document Julia had just placed before him. Croft stayed seated. The hand came back down. Peel attempted a cross-examination of Julia that lasted 12 minutes and accomplished nothing except demonstrating that Peel was a skilled attorney who had arrived at a gunfight to discover his opponent had brought a cannon. He challenged her standing to present technical survey evidence without a licensed surveyor's credential, and Julia cited the territorial statute that permitted document evidence prepared under the supervision of a licensed surveyor, gesturing to Cornelius, to be entered by any interested party. He challenged the chain of custody of the Santa Fe territorial records, and Julia produced the official request letter, the archivist's receipt, and her own sworn affidavit documenting the retrieval, each dated and signed. He challenged the relevance of the railroad correspondence, and Judge Crandall cut that line of questioning short himself with a look that carried the entire weight of 30 years on the territorial bench. It lasted until mid-afternoon. Judge Crandall did not leave the room to deliberate. He sat for 14 minutes after the final arguments were submitted, reading through the documents Julia had placed before him. The room remained full. Nobody left. The air was dense with the peculiar intensity of a community that had expected a foregone conclusion and was now experiencing something altogether different. At 3:27 in the afternoon of October the 14th, 1883, Judge Ellis Crandall cleared his throat and began to speak. He said that the respondent had presented a well-documented and legally coherent case. He said that the survey discrepancies were, in his view, not consistent with innocent error, and that the sequential filing number discrepancy in the territorial ledger was deeply troubling and would be referred to the territorial attorney general for further investigation. He said that the conduct of the county recorder's office in this matter raised serious questions that the court intended to pursue. He said that the railroad correspondence was noted. And then he said that the water rights to Broken Creek, under the prior appropriation doctrine of the New Mexico Territory, belonged to the Hawkins homestead, which had established continuous prior use dating to March the 18th, 1878, and whose claim was supported by the weight of competent evidence before the court. He said that costs were awarded against the plaintiff. He struck his gavel, and the room came apart. There was noise, a sudden, chaotic release of held breath and competing voices, and the scrape of benches and the shuffle of boots. There were men at the back who applauded, which startled even themselves. There were women who turned to each other with wide eyes. There was Harlan Croft, who was still and gray-faced and staring at the middle distance with the expression of a man who has just discovered that the world does not, after all, belong entirely to him. Julia Hawkins stood at the respondent's table and gathered her documents back into the leather satchel with the same careful, methodical precision with which she had laid them out. Her hands were perfectly steady. Her face was still. And then something happened in her expression. Not collapse, not triumph, but a release, small and private and entirely human, like a door that has been braced against a wind, finally allowed to ease back. Cornelius Barker was across the room in 12 seconds. He moved through the crowd the way a man moves when he has stopped thinking about what he is doing and is simply doing it, and he came to a stop in front of her, and Julia looked up at him, and everything she had held steady all day was visible in her face for just a moment. The exhaustion and the grief and the years of it and the relief, all of it compressed into one unguarded second. He reached out and took her hand. He held it between both of his, and it was not the hand-holding of strangers or colleagues. It was something more certain than that, more deliberate, and she felt it and did not pull away, and for a long moment they simply stood there in the dissolving crowd of a courtroom in Redemption Falls, New Mexico Territory, holding on. "You did that," he said. His voice was different from the courtroom voice, different from the professional voice. It was quiet and private and entirely directed at her. "We did it," she said. "Julia." He had never used her first name before. He used it now as though he had been holding it for a long time. "I need to tell you something." "Not here," she said, and something in her voice told him she already knew what he was going to say, and that she was not afraid of it, only not ready to say it in a room full of everyone who had underestimated her. "Come out to the homestead this evening." He nodded and released her hand, and they were both aware that 3/4 of the people in the room had observed this exchange, and neither of them cared. Rose was at her mother's side in the next moment, 8 steps ahead of the crowd, and Julia put her arm around her daughter and held her and said, against the top of Rose's dark head, "We are all right. We are staying. We are not going anywhere." "I know," Rose said, with the matter-of-fact confidence of a 12-year-old who had believed this all along. She looked up at Cornelius with those measuring eyes. "You helped," she said, which was not quite a thank you but was close enough. "Your mother did the work," he said honestly. Rose appeared to accept this as the correct answer. The evening after the trial was cold and clear, with stars coming out one by one over the Cimarron Valley as the last light died in the western sky. Cornelius rode out to the Hawkins homestead along a trail he now knew well, through the dry grass and the scattered juniper, and he could smell the fire before he saw the light in the windows. That particular smell of wood smoke and cold air that he had come to associate over 3 weeks with arriving somewhere. Julia was on the porch when he rode in. She had changed out of the blue wool dress into something simpler and warmer, and her hair was loose for the first time in his memory, dark and long and entirely different from the pinned precision of her working hours, and the sight of it did something to him that he decided not to analyze. She had coffee ready. They sat on the porch in the cold night air with blankets across their knees, and for a while they did not talk about anything that mattered. They talked about Rose, who had gone to bed early and surprisingly easily, as though the day had satisfied something in her that had been tense for a long time. They talked about the stars, which were spectacular out here away from town, and about the sounds of the valley at night, which Cornelius had come to love in a way he had not expected. Then Julia said, "You're going to have to tell me what comes next, for you." He was quiet for a moment. "The government contract," he said. "Briggs will pull it most likely. Testifying against a claim that Croft was connected to, that will be seen as a problem." "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. "Don't be," he said. "I'm not." He looked out at the valley, which was dark and silver under the stars. "I came to this territory expecting a routine survey job. I found—" He stopped, looked at her, started again. "I found something I wasn't expecting." Julia held her coffee cup in both hands and looked at him with those clear, honest eyes. And the thing about Julia Hawkins was that she did not play games with what she felt. She had too much respect for honesty, too much experience with the cost of wasted time, to pretend she did not know what was being said between them. "I wasn't expecting anything either," she said quietly. "I have been since Thomas died. I have been entirely focused on surviving, on keeping Rose safe and keeping this land. I wasn't looking for anything beyond that." She paused. "But I find that I have been thinking about you, fairly constantly, in ways that have nothing to do with survey measurements." The bluntness of it should have been surprising, but Cornelius found that he was not surprised at all. He found that it was perhaps the most welcome thing anyone had ever said to him. He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand again, and this time neither of them let go for a long time. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "If that's a question." "It wasn't a question," she said, with a faint edge of humor that he recognized as one of the things he had come to love most about her, the way she carried laughter inside her precision, dry and quiet and entirely genuine. But it was useful to hear. He stayed for another hour, until the cold made staying in the warmth inside seem more sensible, and Julia brought him coffee inside, and they sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she had spent long nights with Thomas building a life, the same table where she had sat alone in the dark the night before the trial and allowed herself one moment of fear, and the conversation moved from the trial to other things, to his 15 years of surveying work, to her childhood in Missouri, where she had grown up in a family of engineers and had learned mathematics before she could properly read, to Thomas and how they had met and what he had been like, which she spoke of without flinching and without cloaking, in the way of someone who has made peace with loss without needing to erase it. Cornelius listened to her speak about Thomas Hawkins with the particular attentiveness of a man who is listening, not just to the content, but to the person. And what he heard was not a woman defined by her grief or trapped in her past, but a woman who had loved someone genuinely and lost him, and carried that loss as part of herself without letting it be the whole of herself. He told her about Austin, about the woman there briefly and without lingering on it, because it was honest to mention, and he was becoming, around Julia Hawkins, someone who wanted to be honest. "She wanted you different than you are," Julia said. "It was not a question." "Yes," he said, "she considered this. That seems like a significant problem to build a life around." He looked at her. "It was." She met his eyes. "I would not," she said carefully, "want you to be different than you are." The silence that followed was very warm for a cold October night in New Mexico. He left late, riding back under the full span of the stars, and he was aware that something had shifted in him with the permanence of topography. Not the movement of something new into his life, but the settling of something that had already been there, newly recognized. The weeks that followed were busy in the practical, satisfying way of things going properly right after a long period of things going catastrophically wrong. The Territorial Attorney General's office opened an investigation into Dix Halbert's conduct within 10 days of the trial verdict. Halbert resigned from the county recorder's office before the investigation was 2 weeks old, which was taken by everyone in the county as confession enough. He left Redemption Falls quietly and was not missed. Harlan Croft's railroad correspondence was printed, with Julia's permission, in the Redemption Falls Courier, a small, somewhat irregular newspaper run by a woman named Georgette Fell who had been watching the case with compressed fury since its beginning. The story of the water rights trial, the document fraud, and the $30,000 railroad scheme spread through the territory like fire through dry grass. 3 other homesteading families who had previously sold water access rights to Croft under what they had been told were purely voluntary arrangements came forward to the Territorial Attorney General, and an independent audit of the Croft land records uncovered 2 more sets of questionable boundary adjustments. Harlan Croft did not go to prison. In 1883, New Mexico Territory, men of his wealth and influence rarely did, and this was an injustice as plain and as heavy as the landscape itself. But his railroad deal collapsed. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe line, unwilling to be associated with a fraud investigation of this visibility, quietly redirected the spur route to run 40 miles north of the Cimarron Valley. Croft's land empire did not crumble, but it stopped expanding, and the 3 families whose water claims he had compromised received compensation from his estate under a territorial settlement arrangement, which was imperfect justice, but was justice nonetheless. Julia did not celebrate these developments with the bitterness that would have been understandable. She simply noted them, with the focused attention of someone who has learned to document the real world rather than the wished-for one. She had what she had fought for, the land and the water and the right to stay, and a paper record that would protect Rose's claim to it when the time came. She also had Cornelius Barker, who had by mid-November taken on a new surveying commission, not a government contract, but a private one, offered by a consortium of homesteading families in the valley who needed a reliable survey of their collective boundaries before winter set in. It kept him in the territory. It kept him within reasonable riding distance of the Hawkins homestead. It gave him a reason to stop by on Tuesday and Thursday evenings that was not quite necessary but was entirely welcome. Rose had decided by early November that Cornelius was acceptable. She announced this one evening when she was helping Julia with the dishes, and Cornelius was in the next room reading by the fire, which had become a regular enough arrangement that the fire reading was now considered his chair. She said, "I think he is sensible," which was high praise from Rose, and Julia smiled at the wall above the basin. On a cold Thursday evening in the last week of November, with snow coming down fine and steady outside and the homestead sealed against it and warm within, Cornelius sat at the kitchen table after dinner while Rose did her schoolwork at the far end, and Julia sat beside him with her account books, and he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed a small folded paper on the table beside her ledger. Julia looked at it. She looked at him. She unfolded it. It was a deed. A deed for 40 acres adjacent to the Hawkins homestead on the north side, which he had purchased, quietly, from the widow of a homesteader named Addison who had moved back east in September. The land abutted the Hawkins northern pasture. It had creek access. It was good land. She looked at the deed for a long moment, then she looked at him. He was watching her with the steady, unhurried patience that was one of the things about him she found most characteristically, specifically the patience of a man who does not need to hurry toward good things. "Cornelius," she said. "I know what I am doing," he said quietly. I want to be clear that I know what I am doing. I am not going anywhere. I am not a man who does things halfway, and I want you to understand that before you say anything." She held the deed in her hands and looked at him, and the thing about Julia Hawkins was that she understood exactly what this meant, and she did not pretend otherwise. "What are you asking me?" she said. "I'm asking you," he said, "if I may count on the chance to earn the right to be here. Not because you need someone, because you have made it abundantly clear that you do not need anyone, but because you might want someone. And because he paused, and something in the careful, weathered surface of his face softened in a way that she suspected was rare and entirely genuine. Because I have never in my life wanted to be anywhere the way I want to be here." Rose had stopped pretending to do her schoolwork. Julia set the deed down on the table. She looked at this man who had walked into her courtroom battle from pure professional principle and stayed from something else entirely, who had spent 3 weeks learning the language she spoke, who had stood up in that courtroom and given his professional credibility freely and without condition, who had sat at this table in this firelight and listened to her talk about Thomas without jealousy or discomfort, who had looked at her calculating survey discrepancies at midnight and responded as though it were the most natural and admirable thing in the world. She said, "I would like that very much." He covered her hand with his, right there at the kitchen table in front of Rose, who promptly looked back at her schoolbook with the dignified indifference of someone who had known this was coming. They were married in February of 1884, in the Redemption Falls Church on a Saturday when the snow was still on the ground but the sky was brilliant, piercingly blue above the white valley. Millie Pierce stood with Julia, and Millie's husband George stood with Cornelius, and Rose stood between them both in a dress Julia had made her of good blue wool that matched her mother's courtroom dress, which Rose had specifically requested because she understood, at 12 years old, the symbolism of the thing. The reverend who married them was a round, earnest man named Hartley who said the words clearly and without elaboration, which suited both of them perfectly. When Cornelius held Julia's hands at the altar and spoke his vows, he spoke them with a directness that made Millie Pierce press her lips together very hard. When Julia spoke hers, she looked at him with those clear, measuring eyes, and said them with the precision of a woman who means every single word and has the records to prove it, and Cornelius Barker laughed, a short, genuine, entirely happy laugh, which was not typical behavior at weddings in Redemption Falls, but which Reverend Hartley somehow found himself recording, in his own memory, as one of the finest moments he had presided over. They rode out to the homestead that afternoon as a family. Cornelius had spent the preceding months extending the house on the north side, carefully, practically, a room that he had built mostly himself with help from 2 of the valley homesteaders whose survey work he had completed, good men named Alvarez and Cutter who had brought their families to help, and who had made the work into a kind of festival that left the new room smelling of sawdust and laughter. It was a good room, with large windows facing east, and Julia had immediately claimed it for her desk and her documents and her surveying instruments, and Cornelius had looked at it and said that was exactly right, which made Rose look at him again with her evaluating expression and apparently find the results satisfactory. The spring of 1884 was kinder than the preceding 2 springs had been. The cattle herd, which Julia had protected through the hard months with careful management, recovered quickly once the water rights were secure and the creek access uncontested. Cornelius took on a permanent survey commission with the Territorial Land Office, a new land commissioner having been appointed following the removal of Halbert and the investigation into his records, and he worked it from the homestead, which meant the surveying instruments now occupied 2 desks in the east room, and the kitchen table was regularly covered in maps, which Rose found either fascinating or in the way depending on her schedule. Georgette Fell at the Courier ran a piece in March about the water rights trial and its aftermath. With Julia's input, that was picked up by papers in Santa Fe and Albuquerque. Julia was asked to speak at a meeting of the New Mexico Homesteaders Association in the spring, which she did, standing in a hall in Santa Fe and speaking about the prior appropriation doctrine and the importance of proper documentation with the same methodical clarity she had brought to the courtroom. And the assembled homesteaders listened with the rapt attention of people who needed this information badly and had been waiting for someone to give it to them without condescension. Cornelius sat in the back of that hall and watched his wife speak, and felt something so uncomplicated and absolute that he could only sit with it in silence. It was pride. It was love. It was the particular, rare feeling of a man who has found not something that completes him, but something that matches him, something equally whole and strong and pointed in the same direction. Afterward, walking through the Santa Fe Plaza in the cold spring dusk while Rose ran slightly ahead exploring the market stalls, he took Julia's hand and she leaned her shoulder against his and said, "I was terrified." He stared at her. "You were perfect." "I was terrified and I was perfect," she said patiently. "They are not mutually exclusive." He pressed her hand in his and laughed and said, "No, they are in fact exactly you." By the autumn of 1884, Julia knew she was expecting a child. She told Cornelius on a quiet Sunday morning in October, a year almost to the day after the trial, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee and a fire going, and the way she told him was characteristically direct and completely undramatic. She placed her coffee cup down, met his eyes across the table, and told him. The expression on his face was one she kept in the private treasury of her memory for the rest of her life. It was entirely unguarded. It was startled and grateful and suffused with something vast and quiet that had no adequate word in English or any other language she knew, and she reached across the table and put her hand over his because his hands had stopped moving and needed somewhere to be. "Are you all right?" she said. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I am very far beyond all right," and she laughed, which startled the cat off the windowsill. Their son was born in June of 1885. They named him Thomas Cornelius Barker Thomas for her first husband who had built the land they were living on, and Cornelius for his father, and the combination of names was a whole history contained in 2 words. He was a solidly built baby with dark hair and his father's serious eyes, and he spent his earliest weeks being carried in a sling on Julia's chest while she worked at the East Room desk, which Cornelius said was either very practical parenting or the earliest possible start in land surveying, to which Julia said it was both. Rose adored him, which surprised precisely no one who had observed Rose for more than 20 minutes. She took the business of being an older sister with the same focused seriousness she brought to everything, and the sight of 12 then 13-year-old Rose carrying baby Thomas around the homestead with the expression of someone supervising a very important project was a reliable source of private amusement for both of his parents. The valley settled. That is the only way to put it, it settled, the way land settles after water finds its proper channels. The investigations that followed the trial were imperfect and incomplete, as investigations in 1883 New Mexico territory tended to be, but they were real enough that the worst of the land manipulation practices that had characterized Croft's operations lost their protection. Several of the families who had been pressured off their claims did not return, and their absence was a real and acknowledged injustice that no courtroom victory could fully address. But those who remained did so with more security than they had had before, and that was something. Cornelius's survey work expanded steadily. He took on a junior partner in 1886, a young man named Francisco Aguilar who had grown up in the valley and had a natural gift for the work, and he trained him with the same patient thoroughness with which Thomas had once trained Julia, and with something of the same result. Francisco was, within 2 years, extremely good. Julia supervised the water measurement side of the practice, which had grown into a recognized specialty following the trial, and her expertise was sought by homesteaders and lawyers, and eventually, by correspondence, by a territorial water rights committee that was attempting to standardize the prior appropriation process. In 1887, they had a second child, a daughter this time, dark-eyed and loud, who arrived in November and was named Clara. Clara was nothing like Rose and nothing like Thomas. She was her own particular category of person from the very beginning, opinionated and energetic and interested in everything. And she kept the homestead in a state of productive chaos that her parents navigated with a combination of genuine effort and helpless amusement. Rose left for the Territorial Normal School in Santa Fe in the autumn of 1888, at 16, which was young but not unprecedented, and which she had been working toward with the systematic determination of someone who had her life planned to a precision that would have made her mother proud and did. Julia packed her trunk and drove her to the stage station in Redemption Falls and held her for a long moment before she climbed up, and then watched the stage roll down the main street of the town that had counted out her mother, and felt the weight and the lightness of that in equal measure. Cornelius was standing beside her with his hand on her back, and he said nothing, which was exactly right, and then he said, "She will be remarkable," which was also exactly right, and Julia pressed her face briefly against his shoulder and then straightened. "She already is," she said. Thomas was 3, and had inherited his grandfather's name and his father's eyes and his mother's mathematical mind, which was becoming apparent in the way he arranged objects with spatial precision and counted everything with the focused expression of someone taking measurements. Cornelius watched this with a private delight that he expressed mostly by spending considerable hours on the floor of the sitting room building block structures with his son, for the pleasure of seeing Thomas evaluate them for structural soundness. Clara was 1, and had inherited, apparently, her own entire independent lineage of personality, and spent her early years in a state of perpetual motion that her father found simultaneously exhausting and deeply entertaining. The Hawkins Barker homestead. It was called both names in the valley, as though the history of it required both to be complete, was in the autumn of 1889 a working cattle ranch and survey operation of comfortable modest prosperity. Not wealthy. Never wealthy in the way that Harlan Croft had been wealthy, which was a form of wealthy that required other people's ruin for its maintenance. But full in the way that things are full when they have been fought for and maintained, and added to year by year with real work and real love. Cornelius sat on the porch on an October evening in 1889, exactly 6 years after the trial, and Julia sat beside him as she often did in the late evenings when the children were in bed and the work was done, and the valley spread out before them under the same stars it always had, cold and clear and permanent. 6 years, she said. 6 years since you won a water rights trial that everyone told you was impossible, he said. She looked at him sideways. 6 years since you showed up outside the land office and argued with Briggs loudly enough for me to hear you across the street. That was strategic, he said solemnly. She laughed the real laugh, the one that was not the dry small humor of her careful public persona, but the fuller thing she reserved for him and the children and the evenings on this porch. It was absolutely not strategic, she said. You had no idea I was there. Perhaps, he said, and the word carried the comfortable teasing quality of 6 years of evenings like this one. Or perhaps I have always had better spatial awareness than you give me credit for. She reached over and took his hand, and they sat with the stars and the valley and the sound of the creek that was theirs, legally and absolutely, and on the permanent record of the New Mexico territory. And the house behind them was full of sleeping children and lamplight and the accumulated weight of a life built from scratch in the years after everything was lost and before everything was found. Thomas would be glad, Julia said after a while. She said it simply, because it was true and because she could. I think so too, Cornelius said. He meant it. They sat a while longer, and then the cold drove them inside, and the door closed on the autumn valley, and the light in the window burned steady and warm against the dark. In the spring of 1890, a letter came from Santa Fe, from the Territorial Water Rights Committee on which Julia had been serving in an advisory capacity, formally offering her a permanent appointment as a water rights assessor for the Northern Territorial District. It was an official appointment. It came with a territorial government seal. It was, to the best knowledge of anyone in the valley, the first such appointment ever offered to a woman in the territory's history. Julia read it at the kitchen table, which still had surveying equipment on one end of it, with Thomas asleep in the other room and Clara engaged in some project with blocks that was producing significant sound effects. She read it twice, folded it carefully, and set it down. Cornelius had been watching her from across the table with those dark, attentive eyes. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. She looked at him. He was waiting with the patience that was still, 6 years in, one of the things she loved most about him, the patience of a man who never needed to rush her toward any conclusion, who understood that her thinking was her own and would arrive where it arrived, and that his job was to be there when it did. "It would mean travel," she said. "Santa Fe sometimes, other parts of the district. Francisco can manage the local survey work," he said. "He's been managing it half the time already. The children will survive having a mother with a territorial appointment," he said, and something in his voice was so clear and warm and certain that she felt it in the center of her chest. "Julia, you built a water rights case from scratch without a lawyer, against a land baron with a purchased county recorder and an imported attorney, and you won. You have been advising the Territorial Committee for 2 years and half. Their best policy language is yours. Take the appointment." She looked at him across the kitchen table with the surveying maps and the coffee cups and the sound of Clara's blocks and the spring sunlight coming through the window, and she thought about Thomas Hawkins, who had seen in her what Cornelius now saw, who had given her the instruments and the knowledge and the land to fight for, and who was somewhere in the ground and the water and the permanent record of this valley. "All right," she said. She accepted the appointment. She traveled to Santa Fe in May, and then in August, and in the district she was known without irony or condescension as the woman who had taken the Broken Creek case to trial without a lawyer, and emerged with a water rights precedent that was cited in territorial courts for the next 30 years. She brought Rose back from the normal school that Christmas, now 17 and already thinking about the Territorial University in Albuquerque, and Rose sat at the dinner table with Cornelius and Thomas and Clara, and looked at her mother with the clear, evaluating eyes that had never quite stopped evaluating since the age of 12, and said, "You look different." "Different how?" Julia asked. Rose thought about it with her customary precision. "Like someone who has finished a very long job and started a better one," she said. Julia looked at Cornelius across the table. He was watching her with those dark eyes and the expression that she had long since stopped trying to find a word for, because it was simply its own thing, the look of someone for whom the person they are looking at is the entire measure of the landscape. "Yes," Julia said. "That is exactly it." Christmas dinner was loud and full and slightly chaotic, in the way of households with children and too many opinions, and enough love to make the chaos into music rather than noise. Thomas knocked his milk over and Clara ate her brother's bread roll and claimed it was hers, and Rose read at the table between courses until her mother gently removed the book. And Cornelius told a surveying story that involved a runaway mule and a creek crossing that had gone wrong in 1881, which he had never told before, and which made Julia laugh so hard she had to put down her fork. And afterwards they sat around the fire in the sitting room in the long, comfortable silence of people who have nothing they need to prove to each other. Rose went back to school in January. Thomas started at the small schoolhouse in Redemption Falls that spring, which he attended with the serious-eyed attentiveness of someone taking careful notes on the entire enterprise. Clara was 2 years old and entirely herself, which was more than enough for any room she occupied. The creek ran through the valley as it had always run, cold and clear, fed by the snowmelt of the San Pedro Mountains, and flowing south through the Cimarron land that had been the Hawkins homestead and was now the Hawkins Barker Ranch. past the markers that Thomas had placed and Cornelius had confirmed, and the courts had recorded as belonging, first in time, first in right, to the family that had fought for them. In the evenings, when the children were down and the work was done and the valley was quiet under the stars, Julia and Cornelius sat on the porch and talked, as they had sat and talked since the very beginning about work and land and law and the children, and the things they were building, and the things they had built. They talked easily and argued occasionally and laughed frequently, and they were, in the specific and irreplaceable way of two people who have genuinely found each other, completely at home. There was a moment on one of those evenings in the late autumn of 1890, the air cold and pine-sharp and the stars wheeling overhead in that way they had in the high desert, as though the universe was demonstrating what abundance looked like, when Cornelius looked at Julia and said, "I want to ask you something." She looked at him. "Ask. Do you ever regret it, any of it?" "The trial, the way we came to this, no," she said, and the word was immediate and absolute and contained 6 years of evenings on this porch. "Do you?" He looked at her with everything he had, with those dark eyes that she knew better now than she knew any landscape, and he said, "Not a single morning." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the cold autumn air with the creek running somewhere in the dark below them. And the house was warm behind them, and the stars were vast above them, and everything they had fought for was still here, still standing, still real. The water rights to Broken Creek were recorded in the territorial files in Santa Fe under the name of the Hawkins homestead, first in time, first in right, as established in open court on October the 14th, 1883, by one Julia Hawkins, widow, who had appeared without counsel and presented evidence of such clarity and precision that the presiding judge had awarded costs to the respondent, and referred the matter of document fraud to the territorial attorney general. That record sat in the files, as records do, outlasting most of the people who had been present in that courtroom and all of the politics that had surrounded the filing. It sat there as a document of fact, plain and permanent, in the way that good legal records are plain and permanent. Not a story, not a legend, but a line in the administrative history of a territory that would become a state, recording with institutional certainty that one woman had stood up in the middle of everything arranged against her and won. The story, though, the real story, the one that mattered, was written in the survey instruments on the East Room desk, in Thomas Hawkins's brown leather field notebooks still standing in a row on the shelf, in the deed to 40 North Side acres in a drawer of that same desk, in 2 sleeping children and 1 young woman studying for a university entrance examination in Santa Fe, in the particular quality of the evening light through a porch window in the Cimarron Valley when it fell across 2 people sitting together who had each been, in their separate ways, entirely alone before they found each other and who now were not. That story was not in the court records, which is why court records can never tell the whole truth about anything. But it was real. It was as real as water and as permanent as land, and it ran through everything.